let's not get worried about the years. She is an EH research professor. And this fellowship offers a course release, research funding, and a lively intellectual home to faculty members from here at the University of Utah, particularly in the College of Humanities. In the past, this has delivered fine research from past recipients, some of whom are in this room: Carlos Santana, Katarina Gerstenberger, Danielle.
I am the first one.
You're the first one. All right. All right. Excellent. And look at her now. So it really is a pleasure to welcome Rachel, whose project about co-evolutionary theory is on its way to becoming an important book. Her subtitle today promises to turn esoteric theory into lessons for human survival. If that's not the role of a scholar in the climate crisis, I don't know what is. So without further ado, I want to thank Rachel for her efforts, thank her for her work with EH, and I look forward to today's talk, and I look forward to watching these ideas evolve moving forward.
I may have overpromised to get into the book. And then talk it down on my title slide. So interaction with nature, which obviously are a part of surviving. So anyway, let's start at a more basic place. So as a historian of science, my scholarly questions focus on scientific knowledge. First, I ask, how have scientists constructed scientific knowledge? How do they know what they think they know? What materials and methods and sociocultural relationships have come together and been incorporated into the knowledge that they produce? That is their explanations for how things happen in the natural world. Secondly, I also then seek to understand the impact of that scientific knowledge on other parts of human culture and experience. So scientists share knowledge and it changes how we all understand and live in the world. Now, I'm starting from this very broad perspective because my goal in this talk is going to be to give you a little bit of both of these elements in my talk. So it's a very simple structure. And of course, now that I'm here and trying to scroll through my notes, I can't scroll through my notes. You're like, where? Oh, it's probably, that's what it is. It's over here. My cursor escaped from me right as soon as I started. Anyway. My larger project is a book manuscript, as Jeff mentioned, about co-evolutionary theory. So this is a theory that biologists articulated in the 1960s to explain the development of interrelationships between very different organisms on Earth. So in the first part of my talk, I'm going to tell you what I have found in examining the history of co-evolutionary theory and give you a sense of how it developed by following a case in the early history of this study. And then I'm going to close my talk by giving you two brief examples about how co-evolutionary theory has appeared on a larger cultural stage. And in particular, as my title promises, how it's been used to think about human interactions with our environment and how we might improve those interactions. So in other words, how do people extract lessons for humanity from this scientific knowledge? So let's start with co-evolution itself. So you look at these images, they probably reflect some of what you think of if you know at all what co-evolution sort of means. So you might think of the proboscis of a bee or a moth, perfectly fitting the flower so that it can get to the nectary, and feed and also pollinate the flower. Or in the case of this bird, right? This bird and this flower are so closely fitted that probably nothing else can actually pollinate that flower. Or else you might think of the trillions of microorganisms that make their home in the human gut and help us digest food. So co-evolution is an evolutionary mechanism that people invoke to explain these and many, many other phenomena in nature. The idea is that the relationships developed through reciprocal evolutionary change between these partners. And these kinds of images are what the term evokes for most people. It seems mutually advantageous, even maybe harmonious. There's this time-honored vision of the natural world as balanced and maybe even benevolent that these images evoke. Now, the images you see here suggest different ideas about natural relationships. Instead of harmonious mutualism, you see insects feeding on plant tissue in potentially damaging ways. So this is a corn earworm, obviously eating an earworm. This is tobacco hornworm feeding on tobacco leaves, and this is the cabbage leafer. So these are all potential crop pests, relatively, some of them less serious than others, but these three are really recognizable as serious crop pests, okay? One of the key insights in my research so far is that in 1964, when entomologist Paul Ehrlich first coined the term coevolution, these are actually the kinds of relationships that he was trying to explain. He worked with a botanist friend, Peter Rabin. They were both fresh out of graduate school, and they were synthesizing a lot of data about insects that eat plants. And that's how they uncovered larger patterns suggesting that insects and plants were evolving in response to each other. The word coevolution had been used once before in a different context, but this paper was really important in sort of turning it into a buzzword and sparking this whole wave of research that grabbed that buzzword, got on the bandwagon, and turned it into a big flood of research. So one of the first takeaways that I want you to get here is that there is important dissonance between how we all generally imagine coevolution to be, like the previous slide, and this research, which actually originally constituted the theory. Now, when Ehrlich and Rabin wrote about coevolution, they were not just tracking who was eating who, they were also correlating those patterns with the chemical compounds that plants produce. Many plants produce toxic, repellent, or otherwise biologically active molecules. And in many cases, it appears that these molecules tend to protect the plants from falling victim to other herbivores that might hurt them, that might eat them in ways that would kill them. And there are lots and lots of familiar examples, and obviously, because I have tobacco hornworm, I get tobacco and nicotine, but we have also psychoactive compounds like THC, people think might be like the Tanner Humanity Center, THC, right? That's what you're starting. And many plants produce cyanide in different circumstances when they're being eaten. So leaves actually have a compound that reacts when the leaves get crunched and cyanide is produced, okay? But there are some insects, right? So there's the tobacco hornworm. There are some insects that can tolerate these compounds. The tobacco hornworm specializes in eating tobacco because it can deal with nicotine. It can metabolize it and tolerate it when other insects can. And this was one of the core insights of co-evolutionary theory in 1964. So the ancestors of the tobacco plant were developing toxic or repellent compounds. The ancestors of the tobacco hornworm were evolving the ability to deal with those compounds. And the co-evolutionary process is a reciprocal thing that builds over time. And this is what Ehrlich and Rabin proposed in 1964. So again, we have reciprocal co-evolutionary change, but with a radically different tone from that sort of lovely fit between pollinator and flower that we saw in the first slide. And what I have found further in my research is that evolutionary theory was rooted in even earlier work done during World War II. The crux of my larger argument is that warfare was the most important cultural and practical context for the development of co-evolutionary theory. Potent synthetic insecticides like DDT were introduced in the 1940s, and fighting insects was a crucial part of fighting wars against human enemies. They helped protect the food supply and human health. And environmental historians have discussed this in the past. We know that the development of insecticides was often linked to the development of chemical weapons against other humans and defeating, this incredibly racist imagery here, but defeating our insect enemies was equated with defeating our enemies in war. And as well, of course, these war shoot to kill is invoked, even just in dealing with your backyard garden. So this linkage, they helped protect humans and human food supplies, importantly, okay? But by the early 1950s, it was clear that insects were evolving resistance against synthetic insecticides like DDT. And as the world population grew, the battle against crop pests only felt more desperate. And as I argued in my book, the escalating human war against insect pests then shaped biologists' ideas about coevolution in nature. You can see the traces of warfare in the very terminology that scientists use to describe their subject. We know that warfare has been a part of evolutionary metaphor making since the time of Darwin, of course. But I hope you can see that there's a distinctly chemical age twist to all of this that it took on in the mid-century that really places it in this context. The study of coevolution was the study of chemical warfare between insects and plants, by which plants evolved natural insecticides. And by 1971, of course, biologists were referring to coevolution as an arms race between insects and plants. So not only was coevolution a theory that explained antagonistic relationships between insects and plants, it was even conceived of as a form of warfare that echoed our own warfare in the larger global context of World War II and then the Cold War, and in our ongoing war against insect pests. And increasingly in the 50s, like in my other chapters of my book, you can see that the military is increasing. Military funds a lot of research after World War II, but the military is really focused on calling together scientists to try to figure out why insects are developing resistance. So that's part of my paper story. Okay, so there is another form of dissonance here that I want to draw your attention to. What I've shown you so far is a connection between a fundamental theory of evolution in the natural world and insect pest control with insecticides. The connection between these two realms is a distinctive part of the history that I am telling right now. Controlling pests is a form of what you might call an applied science, conducted by economic entomologists, is what they were called, associated with various agricultural technologies, from crop rotation to obviously technologies of the chemical age like DDT. By contrast, studying the ecology and evolution of insects is taken to be a form of basic science. And I have to tell you, obviously, these terms are like highly contested, and especially if you look at historiographical literature and in the history of science, and we just, we're debating with these all the time, but I am kind of treating them as big categories that I'm mostly responding to what the actors are saying about what they think is basic and applied, and how they think it's kind of coming into collision or overlapping. So anyway, I just got out my thing here. Okay, so ecology and evolution of insects, kind of basic, fundamental truths about nature are being uncovered, right? In other words, learning about nature and attempting to control or guide nature have historically been taken to be separate pursuits. In practice, of course, lots of histories of science show that the relationship is very complex and the boundary between the two is porous. And so this is actually a theme I'm exploring in my own work, and especially taking the actors categories into account. Okay. So up until now, I have been talking about the history of co-evolutionary studies in very general terms. Now I'm going to turn to a specific case to show you how this kind of research could unfold. I will continue to explore the discourse of warfare and insecticides that scientists were using, but I also want to emphasize along the way material practices in the work, because this is also important to my own work. So part one, how is co-evolutionary theory constructed, given a single case study example? So meet Daniel H. Jansen. He was an entomologist in training in the early 1960s, attending graduate school at UC Berkeley. And just to be clear on the timeline, okay, that seminal paper by Paul Ehrlich and Peter Raven, that was 1964. So this story starts prior to the publication, and then he defended immediately afterwards. You kind of see him integrate the language of coevolution into his work over the course of it. While Jansen was being trained as an entomologist, he also spent quite a bit of time in the botany department, and he took majors in both fields. But more radically, he also took a minor in the biological control of insect pests. So here we are again at that boundary between basic science and applied science. His research was definitely a basic biological examination of a natural relationship between insects and plants, but his study of pest control shaped how he saw them. So in early 1962, he was still looking for a research topic, and he really wanted to do his research in Mexico, and his advisors were like, there's plenty of stuff to do in California, you don't need to go to Mexico. But they agreed to give him one summer in Veracruz, and so he went, and he spent every day just wandering around, like very desperately probably, looking for a question to answer, right? So he was very like trying to see something exciting, right? So I'm gonna read some quotations here, and these are some quotations from an interview that I did with him. So definitely these are stories he tells elsewhere too, but this is how he described it to me. So he was walking down a road lined with shrubby trees one morning, and his eye was caught by a red beetle which flew over his head and then landed on a leaf. Suddenly, quote, an ant ran up and bit it or attacked it, and the beetle jumped off. I went on, but I could still see that happening. It obviously penetrated. When I walked back that afternoon, coming up the same trail, my mind said, is there an ant on that leaf? So I looked at the actual leaf, and there were ants running around all over it. He also recalls noticing these large thorns. You can kind of see their outline in this sort of crappy. This is really what they tend to look like if you're like in Mexico or Costa Rica. But the thorns, and they have this hole in them. And he gets more of a kind of see what the leaf looks like. And he saw it actually entering that hole in the side of the thorn, right? So his first crude experiment seems to have started in a kind of serendipitous way, just like he tells that other story, okay? He was walking across the pasture, a pasture one day, when he found two acacia trees growing near each other. These are obviously not diagrams of acacia trees, but it was a perfect little simple PNG I could use, so lack of accuracy. Okay, so he found two acacia trees, he cut them both down, thinking that he would drag them back to his house because he wanted to dissect the thorns, you know, kind of see what the ants were doing in there. But he ended up taking only one of the trees back with him. And my guess, having interacted with ant acacias before, is that he was already getting bitten and stung so much by dragging one tree that dragging two was like kind of inconceivable. In any case, he left the second tree right where it fell, and he didn't return to the spot until later. And I'm gonna again read a short quotation from him. And he did it, again, he doesn't recall doing this intentionally, but he happened to, some scientists love to tell stories where it's like this serendipitous, amazing thing that they stumbled across it. So this is again one of those things, like it's a cool story and it kind of drops you into his experience. But of course you have to take it a little bit different. So I happened to walk across the same pasture on exactly the same trajectory, and there was the stump that I'd removed the top from. Nearby was the stump that I left the acacia at. And the stump that I left the acacia at had this gorgeous green, feathery, beautiful, perfect stump sprout coming out of it like this. And the one that was just 2 meters away from it was all ratty and chewed up. And the leaves were all shot to hell. And the light bulb went on. I saw that, and my thesis was just repeat that 5,000 times. Just do it over and over and over again in different circumstances. Because there I have accidentally removed the ants from the tree. There are many ways you can remove ants from a tree, and so I did it many ways. But the bottom line was take the ants away, and what happens to the tree? And that just blew the world apart. So he put together the fact that the ants would attack other animals, and also that the acacia would die without the ants. And he started to think that they might have some sort of important interrelationship. And soon enough, he returned to Berkeley, where he had the good fortune then to meet E.O. Wilson, who, as you probably all know, started his career as an ant expert. And it was Wilson who clued him into a historical debate, actually, that hinged on this particular interaction. So first, there was a 19th century British mining engineer named Thomas Belt, who was working in Nicaragua when he had an experience probably kind of similar to Jansen's. In his 1874 book, The Naturalist in Nicaragua, he wrote that the ants form the most efficient standing army for the plant, which prevents not only the mammalia from browsing on the leaves, but delivers it from the attacks of a much more dangerous enemy, the leaf-cutting ants. Now, of course, not everyone agreed with him. So William Morton Wheeler, also an ant expert in the early 20th century, created an entirely different picture. And he answered Belt's metaphor with a very evocative simile, claiming that the acacia tree needs the ants like a dog needs its fleas. So we have the complete opposite argument: the ants are a parasite on the acacia. So this is how Jansen initially framed the debate for himself, okay? So he had this inkling, then he had this historical debate, he framed the debate, and then he said, okay, how am I gonna do this? I'm gonna remove the ants from the tree over and over and over again. So So first of all, I'll just like spoiler alert, it's not just the tree that doesn't fare well, but the ants also don't fare well. So they don't do very well if you try to rear them separately. You can't feed them very well on an artificial diet. They really need the food, which is there are little nectaries on the ant acacia, and then there are these little things called Beltian bodies, because of course Thomas Bell was the first person to describe them, and they're full of protein. And they actually had it analyzed. It was like essentially the same as like a bunch of yeast, like it had a lot of, it was really nutritious, okay? So the acacia provides food for the ants protect the acacia. And then by the time that Jansen defended his thesis in 1965, after Ehrlich's paper was published, he had the opportunity to see it through the lens of coevolution, okay? So he'd done this experiment over and over. Now, at first, you might be thinking that the relationship between the ant and the acacia very much resembles those nice mutualistic relationships that you saw in my first slide. And in fact, one of them was a defensive one where, we had the clownfish and the anemone, right? That was a good defensive mutualism where the anemone and the clownfish work together. But actually, Jansen's take on this was very different. He actually emphasized the antagonistic aspect that the antagonism, I should say, that the ants showed toward other animals. But he didn't fall back on Belt's metaphor on the standing army of ants. Instead, of course, he saw the ants as a form of pest control. When I was interviewing Jansen, I asked him how he thought his study of biological control might have impacted his work. And he seized onto that connection. Superficially, he told me, and that was sort of the word, superficially, the study of ants and acacias might not appear to have much to do with biological control. But to his mind, biological control of pests is the study of animal-plant interactions writ economic, while his own research was the study of animal-plant interactions writ esoteric. So here he's drawing an analogy between human efforts to control insect pests on the one hand, and the acacia's evolved ability to control its insect predators on the other. And you can also see again his awareness of the boundary between applied and basic science in this quotation. He refers to basic biology regularly as esoteric, which is a word that emphasizes sort of rarefied quality that you might find if you think that knowing nature is a special thing you have to do that's apart from trying to control nature. Yet, even as he relied here upon a contrast, because he's contrasting it, even as he relied here upon this contrast between economic and esoteric, the analogy itself actually, of course, effectively diminishes the difference, because of the word superficial. Superficially, these things seem different, but they really are linked together. Effectively, there is an important biological equivalence between what humans do to insects and what plants do to insects. Very much like all the other analogies I've talked about, natural insecticide and arms race. The connection between human pest control and plant pest control was not just in his representation of the system, however. The material aspects of the history of science come into play here. Of course, you already know that his experimental work involved removing the ants from the tree. But of course, a very effective way of doing that is to spray an insecticide on it. And that is just what he did, dousing an ant acacia tree with the insecticide parathion. Initially, after spraying, and all the ants died, the acacia continued to thrive. It was protected by the residue of the insecticide. But eventually, after the parathion wore off, the tree was fed upon by herbivores and eventually died. So what role did the insecticide play in this experiment? Well, clearly it is an experimental tool of his, but it also becomes a stand-in for the ants, an artificial substitute for the acacia's evolved defense system. In other words, plants often produce toxic and repellent compounds. Through the theory of coevolution, we understand them as chemical weapons. And in this case, the chemical weapons of the acacia are actually the ants themselves, which Jansen effectively demonstrates here. He also made this equivalence between the insecticides and ants quite explicit when he wrote up his research, saying the obligate acacia ants are the secondary plant substances. And secondary plant substances just means all these compounds that plants produce, that aren't involved in their primary metabolic processes that were kind of mysterious for a long time. Like, what do they do? Why do some plants produce poisons or caffeine or nicotine or whatever? So they are the secondary plant substances. And the obligate acacia ants are a multi-purpose characteristic of the acacia. So it's interesting to note here that the agency of the ants in the world, which you would usually find emphasized, thanks to the fact that they're animals, distantly related animals to us, but still recognizable, right? And in their sort of, and a favorite thing to draw parallels between humans and ants, right? Because their industry is very, admirable and things like that. So typically an insect has agency in a scientific story. But in this case, the agency of the ant is replaced by the agency of the plant. The ants are essentially appendages of the plant rather than agentive elements themselves. To reinforce this claim, he pointed out that many other acacia trees actually do produce their own natural insecticides. So the African acacia here is one of those plants I mentioned that can produce cyanide when its leaves are crushed. Jansen's research is such a great illustration of coevolution in part because of the ease with which he articulates the equivalencies on which coevolutionary theory is built. Human technology creates molecules that kill or repel insects. Plants create natural insecticides that kill or repel pests. And other plants support populations of ants that act as a sort of mobile insecticide. Thus far, the argument made is analogical, right? It's a representation of the natural relationships that Jansen has studied. Finally, though, Jansen comes full circle when he materially demonstrates that the biological properties of the ants were effectively the same as synthetic insecticides. I would argue that in this series of equivalencies, we see a naturalization of a form of human technology. Even as insecticides, of course, during this period in the 60s were being decried by many people because of the environmental degradation they were causing. I would think we can also see some scientific arguments emerging here that seem to sort of naturalize a form of technology. The theory of coevolution suggests that humans are actually a lot like plants and other organisms. We construct weapons, we use technology to fight our enemies and make our way in the world. And that brings me finally to the second part of my talk. I've given you a case that illustrates how the scientists generated coevolutionary theory, and now I want to ask how that knowledge touched on other parts of human culture. This part of my talk is definitely more of a work in progress. Thinking through a lot of the implications of coevolution, it will be the final phase of my book. So it's the stuff I'm really grappling with right now. So I'm going to present two brief cases from the 70s and 80s where coevolution entered broader cultural conversations, and specifically conversations about what are humans doing in nature, right? So Paul Ehrlich himself, of course, was one of the people who brought coevolution to a wider audience, publishing about it in places like Scientific American, and weaving the idea into lots and lots of his books. Still, while he was a well-known public intellectual from books like you see here, he was less known for coevolution and more known for kind of infamous claims and suggestions about global population growth that he made. However, his ideas about coevolution reached a wide audience through one of his students, writer, editor, and counterculture figure Stuart Brand, who had studied under Ehrlich in the late 50s, actually. In 1968, this is what a lot of people know Brand for, he launched the Whole Earth Catalog, sort of counterculture handbook, full of articles and products that were intended to help people become more self-reliant, and importantly, help them also live more in harmony with their immediate environments. I want to emphasize, though, that Brand's ideals did not harken back to some kind of imaginary pre-human wilderness. Brand embraced appropriate technologies, those technologies that were practically and well fit to the needs of humans in the immediate environment in which they were used. He endorsed a sort of naturalistic, technocratic future for humanity. And as Paul Ehrlich's student, he came to recognize that the theory of coevolution was a potential resource for that technocratic vision. In 1974, he launched a new publication, the Co-Evolution Quarterly. Its first issue contained a 1968 talk that Ehrlich had given on coevolution, which Brand identified as the founding metaphor of the journal. Brandt continued in this journal to promote appropriate technologies, but it was less of a DIY manual and more of a journal where he got authors from all influential intellectuals and people from all over the country to engage in debates about the future of humanity and their hopes about future technologies, all topics that Brandt essentially saw as co-evolutionary. In a 1981 book on space colonies, which compiled extensive debates that happened in co-evolution quarterly about whether or not we should be developing space colonies and if that was a viable way for humans to move into the future. He wrote, evolution is terribly obvious, but it had not previously been formally recognized about living organisms. They spend most of their adaptive efforts getting along with other life, which is likewise busily competing, cooperating, and avoiding at them. Life co-evolves with life. That includes us. So in Brandt's vision of the world, technology becomes a pivotal means which humans can co-evolve with other organisms. More than an instructive example, evolutionary theory offers almost a scientific basis for arguing that technology could get us out of some of the messes that we had made. In the context of my larger argument, you can see how the origin of co-evolutionary theory in the ideology and methodology of pest control and chemical warfare supports the notion that there is a sort of naturalized, evolved technology that already unites humans with the rest of nature. Now, my second example, again, these are just little brief things, brings us back to Dan Jansen and occasion nuts. In 1994, he won a prestigious prize, the Crawford Prize, from the Swedish Academy of Sciences for his, quote, imaginative and stimulating studies on co-evolution between plants and animals. The prize had just been established in 1982, and he was the first one to be awarded a biological prize. The stated purpose of the award is to, quote, promote basic scientific research worldwide. Along with $100,000, today the award is worth $500,000, by the way. Along with $100,000, Jansen was also given the opportunity to address the Academy with his lecture, which he titled, as I titled my talk today, the most co-evolutionary animal of them all. So Jansen, of course, told his audience all about his original graduate school thesis research, which had in the intervening decades become truly like an iconic case of co-evolution. It's like a very famous case of co-evolution. But then he marked a transition in his talk, telling the audience that he would leave behind his discussion of this highly esoteric area of evolutionary biology. Instead, he wanted to close his talk with a discussion of what he thought was the most co-evolutionary animal, which was, of course, the human. Without a doubt, the most co-evolved of any animal or plant that has ever walked the face of this planet. So first, he gave a little talk about the evolution of humans, claiming that the biological trait special to humans is the ability to fine-tune a set of individuals to a local set of environmental circumstances. Pretty vague, though. It's adaptability to our local circumstances. But it wasn't just that we would adapt to new circumstances, but also that it came naturally to humans to adapt the environment to our own uses. Humans are never content to simply use the world as it is. Instead, humans are like ant acacias, with a very large number of species of ants spliced onto the plant's genome. We have quite literally captured the genomes of hundreds of species of plants and animals, cleared the world of many of their competitors and consumers, and put them to work making products harvestable by humans. So he's speaking here, obviously, of farming and domestication. In other words, like Brand, Jansen saw in co-evolution a lesson about the human ability to use our tools to change and exploit the world around us. And that, in fact, our technologies are what can enable us to co-evolve with other species. Unsurprisingly, the lessons that Jansen gleaned from co-evolution were also a lot like Brand's lessons. There was no return to wilderness and harmony that he was imagining. Instead, he imagined active human change-making in ecosystems. Rather than rewilding, which is a popular word, Jansen proposes gardenification of nature, which embraces the notion really of human engineering and cultivation of the wildland garden. In his research, he has toyed with replacing extinct species with extant species in order to preserve interactions rather than preserving species. In a 1982 paper, Neotropical Anachronisms, he experimented with using grazing animals like horses and cows as replacements in Costa Rica for extinct Pleistocene megafauna, like this Amphitheres, it's like an elephant relative pictured here. Plants with larger fleshy seeds don't have an obvious contemporary seed disperser. There aren't a lot of animals that can actually move those big seeds. So his argument was that the dispersers for these seeds had all gone extinct. Most seeds just fall from the tree and kind of die under the tree. And he said, if human gardeners don't try to re-engineer this extinct interaction, those trees are going to disappear. So I began my talk today by showing you some of the inner workings of the scientific process that generated co-evolutionary theory. I argued that the history of co-evolution was rooted in the ideas and practices of warfare. In other words, built into the creation of scientific knowledge was an effort to control nature, mixing basic and applied research practices and goals together. And likewise, built into the theory of co-evolution itself is an idea of natural evolved technology, particularly in the form of chemical weapons produced by plants. And then I gave you two examples of how co-evolution has been brought into broader cultural conversations. These examples are from the 70s and 80s, but the sense remains today that co-evolution offers us solutions to our environmental challenges. Jumping to 1999, for example, political scientist Leslie Paul Teal wrote that while only of scholars explicitly employ the terminology of co-evolution, the co-evolutionary perspective is implicitly invoked and concretely manifested in the words and actions of growing numbers of environmentalists today. Environmental organizations increasingly describe their work in terms of a dynamic, complex, interdependent world. Their celebration of this interdependence bespeaks a holistic, socio-ecological perspective that affirms the integrated webs of natural and social life. So arguably, in this celebration of interdependence, Gill is invoking this idea of co-evolution, which is reassuring and suggests that different species kind of naturally work together. The arms race, of course, suggests something entirely different, a different moral to the end of the co-evolutionary story, which is actually that there really isn't an end, and species are always just running to try to catch up with each other. Given that the concept of co-evolution encourages us to make a garden of nature, it's important to temper this idealistic vision with a historical understanding of where the concept came from. So here's hoping that my history can add something to this conversation. And I want to thank the Environmental Humanities Project Program. And oh wow, that's interesting. The text slid off the line. My colleagues, I did a version of this talk a couple of weeks ago for works in progress with my history colleagues, and I appreciate their help. And with that, I can take some questions.
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to hurt a question or just a conversation, but
that's fine. Conversation's good too.
Yeah, so this helped me sort of fill in a missing piece of history that's always kind of puzzled me. That's a transition from sort of early environmental movement like silent spraying and founding of the EPA and stuff to what you get later on, where many of these same characters that you presented this to us here start like varied versions of applied ecology, right? And it comes from, and the one thing that's puzzling is like conservation science ends up more or less embracing the use of pesticides and herbicides, right? And in, you know, in 2022, a lot of the same sort of technocratic or technological approaches are still being floated in these circles, right? So they're like gene drive, let's just get rid of a species and gene drive and stuff like that, in a very sort of like managing the garden rather than and you have a nice story here that sort of like helps explain at least part of that shift in environmental thinking. And I'm sort of particularly interested in in the way that one way that this might bleed out into the sort of broader public imagination is in how we think about invasive species, right?
Oh, yeah, I,
So,
like something that's so relevant, and then I actually have. One of the only women in my account, one of the only women I've interviewed. Has an amazing story about wild parsnip that's really about invasive species and losing your, the pest that control the original, like it escapes, obviously, escapes from its normal evolutionary interaction. So, it's hard though, because it's like one of those things where like it's clearly relevant, but it's gonna add so much more, but I'm afraid to open that up. I'm really afraid to bring it into people. But I'm sorry, you can say more.
no, I'm great.
So, I mean, one thing, I just want to say a couple things about, so, biological control was always, like, there was always a threat. Like, there's a couple of histories of etymology that show that there were places, like in California and in Canada, especially, where there were entomologists who were always trying to balance using pesticides. Like they never totally eschewed them, right? But they would use them in certain circumstances that were appropriate. And then basically what happened was that when DDT came along, people were like, whoa, this is so much easier than all that crap you want us to do with biological control. Like it requires so much more work, like to manage things without chemical. DDT just seems so amazing. So it completely wiped that research out. So by the 50s, when people realized that they were facing this insecticide resistance crisis, they were like, oh, we should have stopped doing that research. Oh, there's a lot we don't know. I mean, there's all these conferences that people are like, we don't know much about the basic biology of these, of how insects respond to insecticides even, And so, so that's when it started becoming more popular again, but it still was very much integrated. And part of the story probably is too that entomology has been invested in very heavily by this chemical industry, and it is very hard for them to get away from that. So there's always these strands, and I'm sure Rachel Carson, there's like this little side story that one of my an insect physiologist that I write about at Harvard, kind of it's like this famous, he's like published in several national presses about this insect hormone analog that he finds produced in trees. Okay, so there's a co-evolutionary story there, right? And she writes to him. I have this letter from his archives. Rachel Carson writes to him and says, I've been working on this material. Silence, right? And if what this newspaper, this Life magazine, it was in Life magazine. If this Life magazine article is correct, then all of the work that I'm doing is like basically she was saying, like, tell me, are you going to solve our insecticide problems with this one thing? Of course, that's not at all even. But anyway, it's just such a nice little story. When I found the letter from her, I was like, oh. Anyway, so I don't know if you ever look back. Okay, sorry, that was a lot of things. So other things to talk about? I didn't know.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was such a fascinating story, and I'm just so fascinated by this. I think I have a comment, and then I have a question for you. As I was hearing you, I mean, I'm a rhetorician, so I'm attuned to metaphor and language and intimate institution. And it just seems like that's so salient and so relevant to this story as well. So I mean, maybe that's mostly a comment, but maybe a question is
What
do historical science kind of engage with language?
Yeah.
I guess kind of part of.
Sure. I mean, there's of course the history of science that kind of that thinking about representation was just so, I mean, it's like a lot of other things. We had a material turn and a lot of people trying to not think about. And so, but when you think about representation, we do think about those metaphors a lot. And I had kind of a debate, I have books by rhetoricians and stuff, but then there's kind of a separate parallel thing happening in history of science where people talk about the function of analogy and also the function of narrative, which I kind of, in my writing, I kind of draw on both of those things. So yes, it is, but also I'm not a rhetorician. So it's one of those things where maybe a little bit on thin ice at some points, but also drawing on stuff that some of my colleagues are doing. You know, where we're, I don't know, I would love to, you know, I actually probably should be using more rhetorical, like formally rhetorical tools, but again, that's kind of one of those boxes I've kind of just had a hard time deciding.
Yeah, I don't think you're on thin ice at all, and I don't think you need to use it. I was
Okay.
really excited to hear.
Well, that's actually wonderful to hear that, because I'm terrified, of course, that rhetoricians will be like, what are you doing? You know, so that's great to hear that you have a good response to it. Thank you, thanks.
So I wonder if to push back on Jansen,
Oh,
but
sure.
if humans are the most co-evolutionary animal of them all. Because I feel like there's a kind of or an analog I'm not quite happy with it here, and that's between, for instance, the wonderful ants in the acacia and the work that chemicals do. And I think the case, there's a sort of like who's working for whom question here, right? So the ants in the acacia exist through a kind of mutualism. The ants go away, the acacia dies, the acacia goes away, the ants die. The application of chemicals to particular crops, that's very, very helpful to this one, you know, grass we call corn, or this one tobacco plant. But it's pretty clear that those plants are kind of, and those chemicals are working for a human actor. There's kind of instrumentality there instead of mutualism.
Yeah.
And so, and that may be, and so I just want you to help me understand that, if that's
Yeah.
my work on
Why
that.
would he say
Help me understand that, and maybe what I missed, or what Jansen missed, or.
you missed anything? I mean, I think it's definitely debatable. These are really analogs of each other. And these kinds of analogs are made all the time. So, you know, one of the things that one of the systems that my husband studies is fungus farming ants. And so this system is completely understood through like human agriculture metaphors, but then there are all these questions about, again, who's in control here? Even with the ant acacia, I believe I have to look it up again, but I keep reminding myself to look it up, but I believe that there was recent research that found that there's some in the nectar that the acacia, that the ants eat, that the acacia produces, it has some actually like addictive like property in it too. So it's not just food. They're literally like maybe being kind of enslaved by it, right? So a lot of these relationships, when you look deeper, you know, and I mean, how
It's an ant matrix.
well, I mean, this is true of any kind of ecological interaction. Like, there's no way for humans to like measure all of like the energetic, like every single component of the relationship to figure out like, if you really want to define, if you really are dedicated to like, who's exploiting who here, it's gonna be a hard job to do. So, so I don't think there's like a straightforward answer. I mean, I agree with you, like in principle, like I think humans can make better choices. And I think the end of the story really is that, because, you know, co-evolution like turns into also this idea of like gene culture co-evolution and dual inheritance theory. And this idea that like culturally we're evolving, we have cultural evolution in parallel and also in response to biological change and biological evolution, and that perhaps in cultural evolution we have an opportunity to make better choices, right?
So to sum up and maybe to speak a little bit to the rhetoric observation, the quite astute rhetoric observation, could coevolution be a way, talking about coevolution be a way of making us feel good about ourselves when really it's a version of like control and dominance?
Yes, essentially, that's good. Can you say that again? I'm sorry. Basically, yeah, and yes, it's a way of maintaining that warm, fuzzy, mutualistic feeling while still just perpetuating the same systems that we've been working on the last 200 years. Better results, hopefully. So, I mean, if you look at, I mean, you know, there is this huge push, like the Stanley Robinson, like if you look at Ministry for the Future, right? You're like, there's all these things in Ministry, like all these crazy technological solutions to the methods we've made, right? And they're all incredibly expensive. And like the idea that we're gonna just technologize ourselves out of the mess, like is pretty Yeah, this is like a minute. And her to get on,
Can I
yeah.
just pick up on this?
Yeah.
Because I mean, you know, we've gotten into a very kind of linguistic,
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
almost philosophical
Yeah.
question, because, I mean, mutualism, though, it seems like a better thing, is no less of an imposition of our kind of framework, like, those animals are not actually cooperating.
Oh, yeah.
For species. I mean, they may happen to be working in a way that benefits both of them, but there's not any intent to cooperate. There's not.
Part of my story is also about agency, right? So there's a question of, do we need to, how much do we need to take intent into consideration? And I would argue that we don't take intent into consideration. Because the ants and the acacias don't have intent either, right?
Right.
So if we're trying to draw parallels between the relationships, I don't know, sorry, I didn't interrupt.
I guess what I mean is the characterization of this as a kind of shared, cooperative, happy
Yeah.
endeavor is also kind of, it didn't happen
Yeah,
to work out that way.
yeah.
They've developed, well,
Sorry.
and like invasive species don't work out that way, right?
Right, yeah,
But the invasive organisms aren't being mean or
right,
destructive.
but we are. But we are,
But we
is that what
are.
you're saying? I'm asking, like, is it a contrast? So invasive organisms are not being mean and destructive, but we are being mean and destructive by contrast? Because
Well,
we
I guess,
intend to dominate, because we have an intention to dominate, whereas the.
well, I actually sort of mean that the attribution of any meaning at all to it is every human condition.
Yeah, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, totally, Yeah.
Yes, so whether
Yeah.
it's mean,
yeah,
happy,
yeah.
intentionally destructive, intentionally productive, or useful.
That's a great point. Tell us about ideology and
I
society.
mean, I think something about our character, something really inherent about our characterization of the natural world is loaded all the way.
Oh, yeah, for sure, yeah. Yeah,
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
well, we can't help it, I mean,
So that's kind of,
yeah,
can you tease out a little more for me, the way the kind of Second World War,
Yeah.
kind of history kind of ties into this rhetoric.
Okay, yeah.
Because the characterization of nature as at war, as you kind of alluded, is in Darwin, but it's of course like it's really old. I mean,
yeah,
Tennyson's Nature Red Tooth Claw,
yeah,
you know, Hobbes was a war, you know, that's kind of a human thing, the war of all against all is kind of considered.
Yeah. so this is where it's much.
500, so like characterizing
Yeah.
nature as at war
Well,
is
so
not.
it's actually very sort of practical historical story about entomologists and insect physiologists during World War II. So World War II came along and just tons and tons of them, even just taxonomists who were like working at museums, like identifying butterflies, started going and working for the Allied forces.
Mhm.
And doing malaria control, or one of my insect physiologists that I've written a lot about, worked in England, controlling, working on pests of stored food products. So dried meats and grains and stuff like that. And so the first really careful thinking about why do insects eat what they eat? What is it? They're insect physiologists. Partially there are sensory questions, like what are the triggers for eating? And then like, what is the raison d'etre is actually like, there's a famous paper published in 1959 by one of my figures. It's very famous. The raison d'etre of secondary plant compounds. And it really is that argument that insects, the reason that insects are eating this weird, because they'll be like, why does this insect eat this plant, but no other insects can eat it? You know, and so there's all like, why do they eat this and this and this? And then they say, oh, they're taxonomically related, and they seem to have similar chemical compounds, and they're doing all these things, and they're looking at their sensory systems simultaneously. So that's why, because it's within the context of World War II that entomologists and insect physiologists are doing a lot of this work. And so I think they do absorb this sort of militaristic, this idea of defending plants from insects, for one. And one of the cool things that happens about it is they really start to go, they're insect scientists, they really start to take the perspective of plants. Like it's a very cool transition. It's one of my things really about non-human agency in the story. And not just actual non-human agency, like historical non-human agency, but causal attributions, like what scientists are, how they're attributing agency in their stories. And these scientists really start to say like, oh, these plants are defending themselves, you know, and using these really agentic terms, which Darwin also does, you know, but in this, I think I'm just trying to place it in this particular term.
Rachel,
Yeah.
I have a follow-up to
Yeah.
Tony's point, because back in, while you were talking, I'm also thinking about the Green Revolution and Norman
Yeah.
Borlaug. I mean, my
Yeah.
nerdy question was like, is this what Jansen wanted to go to Mexico? So like, Uncle Norman was, I know, people did the economy, but that's pretty. But I was like, you know, if that World War II, to sort of follow up with your point that focus on the World War II mentality, I mean, to me, it seems that the Green Revolution comes directly out of that as well, and maybe that's too far afield from where you're looking at. I mean, that's more GMO lab than co-evolution.
It's related to actually the other relation that's kind of not like an integral part of the story, but you can't really pull it apart is Paul Ehrlich publishes The Population Bomb in 1968, right? And part of the reason he's wrong is really that he doesn't know how effective, you know, the Green Revolution really is going to ultimately turn out to be, or can feed people. So, you know, and I don't know exactly how it fits together, but it definitely does. And the revolution is obviously tied to resisting socialism too.
Yeah.
So it's about sort of neo-colonial ideas about like spreading the great fortune of our knowledge around the world to show how great we are. And I do think that's part of the story too. And I've tried really hard to make more of a Cold War argument. And it's hard because there's not any real smoking guns, but I do feel like it's in that context of American science is amazing. Look at what we're doing, and we share it. We're truly international, you know. So totally, yeah, that's what I think.
Do you have any sense how the story continues? Does your book end in the 1970s? Or I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, just sort of World War II as a metaphor. I mean, what about now? Sort of the gloom and doom that surrounds us here.
Well,
And I mean, sort of insects. I mean, we don't sort of have splattered windshields anymore because there aren't any windshields. How does the story?
different I definitely love
In the paper, I'm sure you the argument, right? How does this story continue? What kind of metaphors are people using nowadays?
Like 8 months. Oh, how
Yeah, I'm sure you have some ideas. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I guess the way that I'm looking at it now is that I do think that like the way that like the environmentalism for new millennium, with it, you know, Leslie Paul Teal says like, you know, everybody is implicitly using co-evolution. I think there's, but that's pretty hard to, you know, prove. But there are a lot of places where co-evolution seems to be like a buzzword for like, even in humanities, like there are places where people are using the word co-evolution to talk about, you know, materialism and things like that, you know. So I think that co-evolution has really like seeped into a lot of corners. I don't really know. I'll be honest with you, like I'm in the thick of it right now. This is really like, what is the end point of it? What's the I don't know. I have lots of historical stories that I'm telling along the way about why this idea was so persuasive and successful and how scientists made it happen. And then the end of the story, I don't know what it is. Okay. Sorry.
Right where you should be, Rachel. Oh, God.
I mean, I have lots of little inklings, but
So that's what I was asking. What the little inklings I was curious about. Yes.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. Okay. I do think there's it's still a mix of like people being hopeful about the idea that we can like engineer things so that they're gonna actually work
Yeah,
into the
to feel good
future.
about ourselves.
Yeah, there still are some people who would probably, I mean, especially when you're looking at human disease and insect-borne disease, that would talk about it like it's like we still have a battle against
Mhm.
insects. And obviously, we're still like, developing new technologies to protect crops too, because insects just like, viruses and bacteria keep on getting around all of the things that we figure out. So, I mean, I think we just keep running the race over and over
Mhm.
again. Probably it's more gloom and doom than hope, but but we keep latching onto the hopeful idea, right? We keep bringing it up, like this is gonna be a thing that can help us.
Thank you.
Is it more systemic now? And does co-evolutionary theory ever dabble in the idea that there are like more than 2 participants?
Oh, yeah, there are definitely like whole like cohorts of organisms. And then also one of the covers of Co-evolutionary Quarterly I put up was the introduction of Gaia, the Gaia hypothesis.
Mhm.
So a lot of people use coevolution to kind of, the coevolution of the biotic and the abiotic and stuff like that. So yeah, it's very expansive. And there has always been some backlash against that too in biology. Like originally Dan Johnson wrote, like, we need to be more strict about when it's coevolution. And then a few years later, he was like, humans are the most co-evolving. They're always trying to make boundaries, obviously, like against other scientists. They're like, well, this isn't coevolution and this isn't coevolution, but then there's definitely like so you would see groups of animals. And like, for instance, bees, they pollinate a lot of different things, right? It's still a co-evolved system, but it's not as particular as it's not like a one-to-one co-evolution like you see with some of the really, really tightly linked systems. But yes, there's plenty of places where you might say like, when is it not co-evolution? Some people would say that, like, if you start looking, you might see it everywhere, right? But strictly speaking, the most strict kind of co-evolution, you should be able to track this kind of, do parallel phylogenetic trees and say like, here are, like one of the things I did in my postdoc was about people who were trying to like restructure how we thought about primates based on, or rethink how they thought about primates based on primate malaria strains. Because a lot of parasites are species specific, right? And so if you look at those, maybe we can like think about those phylogenies. So that was a long answer. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
That's- useful, I think. So that was fun.